In sheer scale, what I witnessed in March of this year completely overwhelmed me. This was no Wine Australia event. It made the London Wine and Spirit Trade Fair look like little more than a country fete. This was not just one hall, but it was 88,000 square metres of floor space, pavilion after pavilion, every square inch of their facade fully covered in canvas, emblazoned in Technicolor advertising, declaring the estates within. Inside, the investment was mind-boggling. Some estates paid more than 100,000 euros just for their floor space at this event, and the exhibits themselves, exorbitant. Multi-storied architectural flamboyance, glamorous, extravagant beyond words. This is Vinitaly in Verona, one of the biggest wine events in the world. It reminded me more of a World Expo than it did of any wine trade event that I'd ever attended before. And yet perhaps the most terrifying and the most thrilling thing about this event is that it's no international wine showcase. There were international exhibitors there, just a handful in the back corner of the event. Vinitaly is about Italian wines, 4,100 producers of Italian wines. As I made my way from one pavilion to the next in wide-eyed wonder just a few months ago, it crossed my mind just what would it take to actually taste every wine at this event at my usual pace of about 120 wines a day. I did a quick calculation and it would have taken me an entire year just to taste every wine in this place. And yet, Vinitaly is just the tip of the Italian wine iceberg. Italy vies with France every year for the biggest wine producer in the world, and even in the limited harvest of 2014, Italy produced 6 billion bottles of wine. As I pushed my way through the crowd of 150,000 guests at this event, it dawned on me, this is what Australian wine is up against. 6 billion bottles a year. To put that in world perspective, the world produces at the moment about 32 billion bottles of wine. If you take the Australian chunk of that, it's tiny. We produce about 1.5 billion, which is broken down into about 600 million that we consume ourselves and about 900 million that we export. We import about 100 million bottles that we drink. Those numbers are mind-blowing and a bit too big for me to fathom, so I prefer to understand it like this. A Melchizedek is the biggest bottle of champagne that you can buy. It's probably around about that size. Stands 4 feet high. It contains 30 litres, 40 bottles. It's probably too big for most of us to lift, let alone pour. If you imagine a Melchizedek is the entire production of wine in the world in 1 year, Australia is producing a little less than a magnum. We are drinking less than a bottle, of which about a glass is imported. Massive numbers. The question is for us today, how do we fit into such a phenomenal wine world, a phenomenal spirits world? Similar proportions exist in any spirits category. How do we compete with all that? How does Australia engage? What does our country have to offer to stand out and attract new customers? That's a photograph at Vinitaly. Yes, it was actually like that. How on earth do you get noticed in an increasingly complex and convoluted national and international wine industry? I'm not a marketing expert, but I spent a lot of time speaking with people around the world who are much more clever about these things than I am in recent years. And I've got a few ideas for you this afternoon to tie in with what we've heard already today. What can we discover from champagne, which has got to be the most successful beverage marketing campaign in all of history? What can we learn from Australia's most successful wine marketers and wine retailers What can we learn from national primetime television? And most importantly, what can we learn from giant crocodiles? Brisbane is home for me, and it was in May this year that an ABC Talkback radio station decided to put it out there that Brisbane was lacking any sort of iconic tourist attraction. So the calls came in and the suggestion was put forward that we should build a giant crocodile. Australia loves giant things. We've got lobsters, bananas, pineapples, merinos. I think there are 70 or 80 big things around Australia. Headline-stealing fads, perhaps. They'll get the news on the first day. But do they really build tourism? Do they really provide profile and a link to our markets? You see, I reckon Australian wine has quite a few giant crocodiles of its own. For many decades, it's been progressive innovation and technology that have been the thing that we've used to differentiate ourselves from the rest of the world. In the 1980s, it was bulk, bargain-priced Shiraz and Chardonnay that became our giant crocodile, and didn't the world love them? In the 1990s, ripeness and oak became the darlings of a Robert Parker-fueled bigger is better campaign. And in more recent years, it's been pushing of wine growing and winemaking trends, such as sustainability, biodynamics, organics, natural wine even, whole bunch fermentation, new grape varieties. You can add to that list ad infinitum. The problem is, these things, while valid in themselves, and there are certainly many great things up there that we should champion, natural wine and ripeness and over-oaking, perhaps debatable, but that's a topic for another day. But there are many great things here, and I'm not for any minute belittling those. But the point is this: if our point of distinction, if the thing that we are putting our hopes on to ground us in a sea of 32 billion bottles are these things here, then we are pinning our hopes to short-term principles that do not last. Innovation and technology from Australia is now used in every corner of the wine world. We can no longer, and never will again, compete with South Africa and South America on bargain pricing. Ripeness can be dialed up virtually anywhere in the wine world now, particularly in the wake of global warming. Anybody can buy oak. Both are out of trend anyway. Sustainability, New Zealand is doing better than we are, arguably. And each of these other factors, I reckon, is just as much a part of Australian wine fabric as it is for perhaps 100 other wine countries. Giant crocodiles, good in their own right, but not our key distinguishing features. What is it then that will allow us to stand out? What's the message and the story that will secure the future of Australian wine and other beverages in an increasingly complex and convoluted wine world? And what is it not? Andrew Jefford, UK writer. Most nations are good at identifying their own problems, but fail to solve them because they choose culturally comfortable solutions. Australia's wine community, he suspects, will carry on using lavish research funding to find ingenious technical fixes to a multitude of difficulties. They'll carry on using science, teamwork, and liberal expertise to create further efficiencies and continue to regard technically pristine Australian aesthetic norms as the ones which really count. But the end result of all this is that a set of fine wines which are more often admired than loved. They win competitions, but fail to empty wallets and set hearts pounding. Confronting words. The challenge for us is what instead? I'm often asked by small winemakers, what are the things that are going to define the trends for the future? How do we make ourselves known? How do we set ourselves apart from the market? Even one of the senior winemakers at Penfolds just last week said to me, what are the varieties that are going to be exciting in the alternative sphere in the years to come? These are questions I ask myself often. as a writer and a communicator, what are the things that really engage with the market? Not just passing fads, but what are the things that are going to make a difference well into the future? I learnt something of the answer from perhaps the most unlikely place and the most unlikely person last year. His name is Joe Holliman, and he's a winemaker in the Tamar Valley.
Vintage can be a fairly mentally quite a stressful time, depending on the season and how everything's going. We try and make it as relaxed as possible, and I don't think it is really that stressful.
The pace is just right for this former Tasmanian wicketkeeper.
So I'd go to England and play cricket, sort of became getting out of going to university.
And he never did get any qualifications in winemaking.
How do the whole berries change the wine at this point?
Not being a scientist, I'm not really sure, but some guy in Burgundy told me that, you know, it adds complexity, so be good enough for them, good enough for me.
I trust Joe with what he's doing, really. Well, I know that sounds, I know people would be very surprised, but his method is working.
I've come up with my way, and that's just the way we do it. Best thing about not being trained in what I'm doing, I don't know the consequences.
It's proven to have worked so far.
Vintage can be a fairly...
He's just a legend. If you saw closely, you would have seen that his marketing is so good that he was actually wearing a Leconfield shirt as part of a national television filming. He knew for months we'd be there. What a lovable guy. It's been a real privilege over the last year to create what many of us have dreamed of for a very long time, and that is an opportunity to take Australian wine stories, not to fanatical Australian wine lovers, but to national television, to engage with Australian consumers who might drink wine but never read about wine, and to take stories like Joe's in a series which we called People of the Vines. We followed 6 winemakers through vintage in northern Tasmania last year. We filmed the same thing in the Barossa this year. And we had the privilege of going to national television in September last year. And we're thrilled to find 1 million people tuning in across the country, doubling the ratings of that time slot at the time. We've since flown on Qantas on some 3,000 flights every week for nearly 6 months, and on Virgin. And in 3 weeks' time, we have our international premiere across 60 networks in 46 countries and 180 million viewers. The stories of Australian wine going out. One of the things that surprised me the most is the way in which people have engaged with these stories. There's nothing scripted. It's quite exciting and more than a little bit unnerving to front up to a winery in the morning every day for the duration of vintage, purely to film what happens there that day. And anybody, as many of you have, who've worked in a winery know the kind of stories that play out during the stresses of harvest. And the thing that's driven our stories the most has been the personalities of the winemakers, their wives, their husbands, their children, and their co-workers. Their idiosyncrasies, their stresses, their tensions, interactions, disasters with mechanics, rain at the wrong time, the way that their wives cope with all this. These are stories that are in many ways captivating. And one of the things that has surprised me through that process is that of each of these 6 winemakers who we've followed, the feedback from our viewers is that different people relate to different personalities and really feel an affinity. And you know, it's been Joe Holliman who many of our viewers have related to the most closely. The least auspicious of all of our winemakers, but in many ways perhaps the most lovable. He does not have anything like a remarkable story. And yet, what we hear from our viewers is that they just want to go and meet him. They want to go and see his place. They want to fly to Launceston. They want to taste his wines. And here's the point, they want to buy his wines because they've engaged with his story. Winemakers, wine marketers, industry people, the thing that sets you apart from every other brand in the world is your story. And no one else anywhere can ever replicate that like they can all of those other things. It was in Brisbane just a couple of weeks ago that I was in the lounge room of Stokehouse sommelier Ben McNair in conversation with Michael Dillon about some of these things. Michael, as many of you know, is the great name behind Bindi Wines. And Michael said to me, there are two stories that really matter in wine, the story of the people and the story of the place. It's interesting that if we put winemaking or wine growing or even wine tasting on television, there's not necessarily something there that really engages for people. But the thing that each of us, I think, has an inherent fascination with is the lives of people. And it's fascinating to see how this plays out in modern culture. Mainstream television, Top Gear, phenomenal success. You don't have to be a car nut to like this program. It's really about the personalities of the presenters, for good and more recently, perhaps for bad. MasterChef, Lindy Milan said to me recently, and I thought this was quite insightful, MasterChef's not a cooking program, it's a game show. And it's all about the personalities of the contestants, the judges, and the guests. Who watches spelling bee on television? It's not about the spelling, it's about the people and their lives. And so the way in which these things are able to engage, and it's true for us, is that it's all about the people. Your most engaging selling point, your most important marketing angle, and your most unique point of difference is simply you. You and your story. I've always loved Coopers, but goodness, after hearing Glenn Cooper's story this morning, I feel a love for Coopers and a relationship with that brand like I'd never known before. What a tremendous story that was. Sharing your story is about sharing yourself. Last week, one of Western Australia's most long-standing and successful independent wine retailers confided in me that he's turned his business around and raised profits by 60% this year through one strategy. He said Sundays were my most... they were so quiet I was going to shut the shop on Sundays. He was turning around $1,500 on Sunday with the restaurant and the retail business. He said, rather than shutting it down, I turned it around. I invited winemakers to come in, to run tastings, masterclasses, lunches and dinners. He said, I'm now turning around tens of thousands of dollars every Sunday because they're sharing their stories, they're engaging and they're connecting. He said, if I can get one person to come back through one of those events who hasn't visited my shop in years, he said, I've noticed on average that person will return 3 or 4 times in the months to follow and they'll buy. Engagement. It's about engaging with consumers, about connecting and about building relationships. Too often in the wine industry and the alcohol industry in general, I think we forget we are part of the hospitality industry. And hospitality at its core has to be about relationships. And if relationships are true, they have to be authentic. We've heard today from Andre and from Stuart about authenticity. Stuart used the word people as one of his P's. Andre talked about his tribe. Same thing, building relationships, real and authentic. Too often wine marketing is all about contrived stories. I receive a stack of wine samples every day of the year through couriers and the post, and in those boxes are all manner of convoluted press releases with creative attempts to make this wine significant because of some invented story. If it's not authentic, it doesn't engage. People today more than ever in a digital age in which communication is rife are looking for authentic communication. They are craving real stories. And if they smell advertising, marketing that's contrived and convoluted, it turns them off more quickly than ever. As Stuart said before, advertising is a waste of money. When it comes to food and wine, this was in the Telegraph in the UK just recently. When it comes to food and drink, the obsession with provenance and authenticity shows no sign of waning. We live in an era in which people are looking for authenticity. They want to know the real story of where their produce came from, how it was made, and the hands, perhaps even the feet, that's Joe Holliman's foot by the way, the feet that made the wine. What does that mean for us? How do we do this? It means get out there and tell your story. It means engage with consumers, with clients, with retailers in a way that's authentic and builds a relationship. And I'm not just talking about social media. In fact, I think in some ways social media can be anti-social media because it lulls us into this feeling that we've got an established relationship when in fact more and more people are looking for real experiences. They want to come and visit, they want to walk in your vineyard, they want to feel and taste your wines. Chester Osborne, Durrenberg in McLaren Vale. He's constantly hosting dinners all around the country with a bag of tricks that tell his story. Bernard Hicken, Jacobs Creek. He's always on a plane hosting another tasting somewhere around Australia or around the world. Wayne and Brenda Dutchke, Barossa Valley. They're welcoming their customers into their shed. Drew Noon in McLaren Vale writes a personal handwritten note with every single case of wines that he sends out. I know that because I have lots of friends on his list, and every one of us gets a different note, and it's personal. Jeffrey Grossin was telling me just this morning that he is currently running dinners around the country and lunches for clients who've been on his mailing list for 30 years. And he said to me earlier, with no small amount of emotion, someone said to him recently, "You're a part of every family event in my family," because his wines are engaging and connecting. That's about relationship. That's about what it means to build a brand. And in Australia right now, I reckon the person who's networking internationally better than anybody else is Peter Gago, chief winemaker of Penfolds. Not because he's engaging constantly with the key influences of the wine world, but because he's engaging with the key influences outside of the wine world. When Kings of Leon visited South Australia a few years ago, they spent 7 hours in the state, 3.5 hours at their concert, 3.5 hours at Penfolds. When international CEOs jet into Australia, Peter's told me of instances they fly in their private jets, they've fobbed off the Prime Minister in some cases in favour of spending time with Peter. What is it that draws key influences in the world to people like Peter? It's hospitality. He's as generous with his time as he is with his cellar. He's discreet and he values relationships. Send him a text message, you get a reply. He relates to individuals and he draws them in and encourages them. He said to me, when I talk about this, people think I'm skiting, but I just want to remind them that Australian wine can get to this level. This is something I'm trying to do around the world. We need more personalities with Peter Gago levels of enthusiasm. And we had much to learn about Champagne. I spend a lot of time in Champagne. I write a lot about Champagne. And I reckon there's no beverage marketing campaign in the world more profound than taking a region that can't even get grapes ripe to the point of producing still wines. They produce insipidly austere and undrinkably acidic juice. And they've managed to transform that into the most celebrated beverage in the world. Ridiculous. And the campaign continues. Purely based on Natasha's numbers this morning, we learnt that sparkling wine in Australia has diminished in consumption by about 8% in the last 4 years. Have a guess what Champagne has done in Australian consumption in the last 4 years? It hasn't diminished by 8%, it's increased by 76%, and not off a small base. 6.5 million bottles a year now. Champagne is a tremendous marketing machine, and yet for years, the message has been closed. Guarded brands, marketing frippery, those glamorous boxes that they put a high price to, sightings with supermodels, websites that have more glitz than useful content, and yet even this is changing. There are winds of change in Champagne, and we're going to see this from the old world more and more because it's driven by a big picture situation. As you know, Europe's in crisis. The global financial crisis has hit Bordeaux, Burgundy and Champagne hard, and probably none harder than Champagne. This could not have come at a better time. Champagne's been badly burnt, right on the brink of facing massive undersupply. Champagne was scurrying in the background to brazenly increase yields, to even extend its boundaries, because the projections were We're going to run out of supply because of growing demand, not from China, but from Japan, US, UK, Australia, etc. What's happened instead is that Champagne, by virtue of the European slowdown, France drinks half of Champagne's production. It's been forced to slow down its growth, thank goodness. And at the same time, the spin-off has been that Champagne is pitching its sights much more decisively on overseas markets, like Australia. And so they're listening to us and they're responding. Look at the way in which branding's changing in Champagne. The labels are changing. They're producing new websites, much more informative. When Krug introduced its ID a couple of years ago to unlock the story of every single bottle of champagne that it releases, everybody was watching. Louis Roederer was the first to follow with a website in which you can actually put the bottling code and will give you the background. And after that, Veuve Clicquot has introduced QR codes. These things are revolutionary and groundbreaking for Champagne. They're a sign of the fact that they're engaging. For once, thank goodness, they're telling the real story, not about marketing and branding and contrived stories. People want authenticity. They want to get under the surface. They want to understand the real origins and the hands that produced their products. Look at the rise of grower champagnes. Today, 4,509 champagne growers produce their own champagnes and sell them. That's 12 times the number of champagne houses. Antoine Roland Bilcar, from Bilcar Samon, with the diversity of Champagne's regions and the rise of growers, it's increasingly important for us to produce more interesting small production wines. The houses are listening and watching. Laurent Darcourt, Managing Director of Paul Roger. Once upon a time, the houses didn't own vineyards. Now they're becoming more like growers. Meanwhile, growers are sourcing from many villages rather than just one, becoming more like houses. Many cooperatives now have their own brands and they're acting as negociants. The stories that really matter for your wine are the stories of the people and the stories of the places, like this one. Communicators, the village in Champagne in which Louis Roederer owns 10 hectares of biodynamic vineyard, the most important and most significant biodynamic vineyard in the sparkling wine world. They released a new label exclusively from this vineyard, the first new Louis Roederer product in 40 years last year. And when I was standing in the vineyard and Jean-Baptiste Lecaillon, chef de cave, was introducing it, he told me that the terroir had to be the key. He said that was the secret to making the wine. He didn't set out to make a zero dosage champagne, but it's just what the terroir called for. He said the paradox to this cuvée is that the marketing is all about Philip Stark, but the wine is all about the terroir and the vineyard. Your most engaging point of difference is you and your story. And your second most engaging point of difference is your place, because no one anywhere in the world has a place exactly like yours. Some say the French word terroir is overused. Call it pancara if you prefer, call it sense of place. But mark my words, after your own story, the single thing that will sell your product better than any other is the unique story of your place. Andrew Jefford, give a warm corporate hug to a concept which many in Australia still regard as vaguely suspicious. It's great to see places like the Barossa Valley, and this is a tour that they hosted a few months ago, bringing people to the vineyards, showing them the soil. There was a pit behind him you can't quite see. This is Ken Semler, the vineyard grower, Wayne Dutchke's vineyard. They were tasting the wine from that vineyard. When it comes to telling the story of your place, I'm not talking about when you arrived and knocked up a shed and banged in some posts. I'm talking about aspect, elevation, microclimate, topsoil, bedrock. I'm talking about the stony austerity of a grey winter morning, of the honeyed radiance of midsummer spring. I'm talking about the dusty north wind at the height of summer. I'm talking about the harsh austerity of a rough continent translated by 100-year-old vines into the texture and the flavour of Shiraz. There are two stories in wine that count, the story of the people and the story of the place. had lunch with Brian Crozer in Sydney a couple of years ago, and he referred to some quite confronting truths. South Africa and Chile are much more on track when it comes to talking about their terroirs than we are in Australia. Oregon and California are so far ahead of us in promoting their terroirs to their consumers and producing wine styles that are unique to their regions. We could learn something from them. Our industry promotes itself on winemakers and winemaking rather than regions and viticultural innovation. Harsh words. He continues, this is a long-term game. The great advances in our industry have been made where pioneers have opened up new areas, going back to Busby and Carl Seppelt and the development of northeastern Victoria and the King Valley. These are the really big breakthroughs in Australian wine. Many of the regions that we now work with didn't exist in the 50s and the 60s. You can see the list. All re-established or started anew in Crozer's time as a winemaker. He says, finding these regions and the right varieties to match them, these have been the real breakthroughs. These are the true innovations. Everything else is just noise. These are the things that change the course of winemaking history. How do we make these things our story? We do it by making wines that are true, not to a fad or to a regime, but true to a place and true to us as people. And we tell those stories. Crozer again. You have to be consistent over a long period of time. You need to tell the stories of regions and sub-regions in a consistent way that evokes emotion. No matter how much detail you provide, those who are interested will listen. Increasingly, the wine world is full of consumers who want detail, scientific and historical integrity. They want authenticity. They want real stories that link place with taste and winemaker. That's the essence of it, said Brian Crozer, and that's what we're lacking in our industry in Australia. Linking taste with people and places. There are two stories that really matter for a wine: the story of the people and the story of the place. These are the stories that will set our wines apart from 32 billion bottles. These are the stories that will make Australian wine engaging for mainstream television. These are the stories that will outlive any temporary fad or marketing technique. And in Australia, we have characters and personalities, and we have terroir and diversity and geology. More interesting and more worthy, I believe, than any other region on the planet. Now it's our turn to tell those stories. Thank you.